So everybody who made it up to this point in the day deserves some kind of acknowledgement, a medal or a Peace Prize or something. Especially our students here who have been here all day long. So I'll try really to keep it as brief as possible. So basically this presentation has two parts. In the first one, addressing the issue of the killing God fantasy, as I call it, as one of those main ideas that characterize modern times, I think. And the other one is basically the answer or analysis of the second part from the title, Why Only Christianity Can Do That Effectively. And I apologize in advance for some of the abstract ideas that I'll put forward, and for a very brief summary. So maybe we'll have some time during the discussion to shed more light on some of these points. So the death of God is one of the central fantasies of modernity. No matter how we understand the main properties of modernity, getting rid of God, and specifically the God of Judeo-Christian tradition, will appear as the important constituent of modernity and modernization. Where can we see that? Well, if you take three characteristics of modernity in modern times as paradigmatic, and I think these three can be named as such, like progressivist paradigm, freedom paradigm, including individual rights and liberties and pluralism and so forth, or secularization paradigm. In all three we find death of God as an important constituent. This drive to get rid of God, to kill him, seems to exhibit the structure of a fantasy. It begins, as fantasies begin, as a desire which fascinates by its imprecise, cloudy promises. This desire then becomes operational. It starts structuring the reality. So that's fantasy. Fantasy is not just abstract. Fantasy actually structures reality. Why this fantasy? What is the source of this desire to kill God? One way to approach this issue would be to locate the origin of this desire in a specific concept of God as an external authority, which can easily turn into a tyrannical figure. This vision of God is then related also to the concept of God's representatives on earth, his advocates and ministers, embodied in institutional churches or religious institutions more generally. God is, following this train of thought and this fantasy, God is viewed as an evil patriarchal figure, or even worse, as a completely alienated dictator who, often through his ministers and his propaganda narratives, such as official religious doctrines, imposes oppressive ethical and political systems and exploits his subjects. If this description captures at least some of the modern dissatisfactions with God and everything related to him, it is not difficult to recognize the perspective from which the above-given narrative is told. It is the perspective of an innocent child who is exposed to the brutalities of the paternal figure, which the child has no control of. And that's why it's a fantasy. In other words, we are already here in the domain of a fantasy. Moderns, going back to Bruno Latour's understanding of the term, the moderns, and not only them, like to think of themselves as innocent children, those who start from tabula rasa and therefore can, with clean hands, engage in a critical, often self-righteous discourse. Is it not that in this fantasy about the gaze of the innocent child, one should look for the origins of another typically modern fascination, the one of a rupture, revolution, acts that make everything new? Modernity often appropriates the biblical idea captured in Isaiah 65:17, quote, "Behold, I will create new heavens and a new earth. The former things will not be remembered, nor will they come to mind." Very kind of typically modern. However, this eschatological impulse that we find in modernity so often felt throughout this time, that's relevant also for this meeting, is a de-eschatologized one that really does not need new heavens and a new earth, but rather a different distribution of power structures within the old heavens and the old earth. Is it not also that in this innocent child's gaze, one should look for the contemporary, so widely spread sense of entitlement? What once upon a time was unacceptable behavior of a spoiled child became now a cultural norm. Is it not for this fantasy that the whole social and private sphere became also redefined in terms of allowed and prohibited or suppressed sexualities? The whole sphere of sexuality becomes redefined in such a way that it is remarkably childish. A story told supposedly from the perspective of an innocent child who is not aware, or rather refuses to be aware, of its own sexuality. Behind this culture of infantilization is of course the business logic as well, but I'll set that part aside. The child's gaze fantasy stands for the fantasy of innocent happiness and irresponsible freedom, the paradise lost that the moderns hope to achieve through various kinds of interventions, reforms and revolutions. The fantasy of the promised happiness and freedom thus leads to new forms of oppression. And I think modernity is partly precisely about that, offering new forms of oppression under the pretext of new forms of liberties. The moderns are surprised when they discover that there is no, nor there has ever been a tabula rasa from which one can start anew. There has never been a really new beginning. The usual mechanism is then to deny it, to close their eyes, pretending they were children, and then move on into another reform or revolution to fix the problem whose very existence is dubious, and the proposed solutions even more so. This happens also with the killing God fantasy, with that God who is imagined as an authoritarian, transcendental being or principle. Killing or marginalizing God stands for the fantasy of liberation, for a free, creative, and unconstrained flight of the human being. However, what modernity ends up with, once this God is killed, is not unconstrained freedom and a creative flight it fantasized about, but rather new gods and new forms of constraints and oppression. These gods function as gods not in some abstract and purely metaphorical sense, but in a very precise way, as the ultimate horizon of meaning, the ultimate authority that demands obedience, sacrifice, reverence, and that promises some vague benefit or salvation. However, one should note that the double function of God or gods as an external oppressive authority, both in the modern and in the pre-modern times. So the double function of those authorities. On the one hand, these gods are authoritarian and prohibitive, but at the same time, they're also permissive. That's the whole picture. When we need them to let us do what needs to be done, they readily grant their permission. And what needs to be done can range from committing a genocide here and there, colonial oppression, to the contemporary attempts to destroy the entire planet following the neoliberal paradigm. One can think of many other rational or reasonable things that supplement the modern fantasy of progress and enlightenment that the modern pantheon is eager to bless. Thus, killing God, as captured in the secularization paradigm, does not end with a no-God empty page, but with new old gods, most of which had anyway been operational under the disguise of a transcendental single authority even in the pre-modern times. These new gods can include capital, market, state, nation, progress. The list can be indeed a very long one. So to the second part, how can Christianity kill God, and why only Christianity can effectively do that? To see this, one needs to make a clear distinction between the fantasy of God as an external, paternalistic, oppressive authority, who at the same time permits his subjects little dirty pleasures every once in a while, and the canonic God, self-emptying God that one can find in Christian tradition, together with the authoritarian one. There are two cases of the death of God in Christianity that one can think of. The first one is the death of God as an external, precisely as an external paternalistic authority. Christian theology fundamentally rejects this idea of God in its best core tradition. It rejects God as an external authority precisely by pointing to God as love. God who is powerless in the presence of human freedom. God who believes in the human being and desires a communion with the human being. God who is not an external authority but rather a co-sufferer. This is related to the second instance of the killing of God, and that is the literal death of God, God who dies on the cross. Before dying on the cross, God becomes a human being. So death of God was at the same time a human being, God-man, or theanthropos, is at the same time the full immersion of God into humanity. And a separation from God, an experience of God abandonness, because that is what death in the ancient tradition of Judaism means, separation of God. So God enters the state of being separated from God. God, that means death of God, death of Christ. Rejection of God as an external authority and accepting God as a co-sufferer, the one who loves and is awaiting a loving response, kills all gods as authoritarian figures. The figure of power, viewed from this perspective, the figures of power viewed from this perspective appear as impotent puppets, needed only by those who cannot cope with their freedom or who do not want to cope. So, and this is based on Freud, those who actually are afraid of their freedom need an external, paternal figure. God who dies in a shameful way, let us not forget that God who also dies as a criminal, which was precisely Christ's death, is the God who liberates, not for the innocent child's view of fantasies that need permissive oppressors, but rather the God who liberates from the fantasy itself. And this liberation can make one see the desert of the real, to borrow from Slavoj Žižek, left by the late modernity adventures, and develop in this landscape one's own person through a creative effort. Thanks a lot.